if you look at what they say, both Trump and Iranian leaders, you'd think we're right back to where we were in March and April. But actually, if you look at what they do, there are still some limitations. I mean, the most obvious of these is that Israel is not back in the war. Now, from an Iranian perspective, the Israeli Air Force is a very powerful hammer which could be used against them. So I'm guessing that for the moment, they don't want to draw Israel into this.
And Mark Urban is here, as he is every Monday, to talk us through the big foreign policy, diplomatic and defence stories. Hello, Mark.
Good morning.
Good morning. So look, Andy Burnham, by the end of the day, indeed by the end of the morning, he will be our new Prime Minister. What are the big foreign policy challenges that are going to be waiting in his in-tray, do you think?
Oh, my word. Well, of course, that's been the advice that a number of former prime ministers, including Theresa May last week, have given him, is don't think you can ignore the foreign stuff in favour of the domestic agenda that he's clearly very much committed to. Well, you've got the ongoing war in Iran, in the Gulf, with Iran and the US, and of course this big question about to what extent does the UK support or not Iran in that. We're at a point now where the US may want to scale things up again, and so British bases, Fairford in Gloucestershire, the base in Cyprus, those kind of things become very important in that context. Then there's the whole gamut of other international issues, Ukraine, of course, trade issues. So there will be a lot on his plate in terms of foreign and security policy.
He'll come under pressure almost immediately to commit to spending 3% of GDP on defence. Presumably NATO allies are going to be watching his first moves very closely.
Yes, well, we've heard this from the US ambassador to the UK. More or less, we'll be keeping an eye on you. I think his room for manoeuvre here is really quite limited. We saw a few weeks ago John Healey resign over a settlement that was only very slightly worse than the one that eventually emerged once Dan Jarvis had been appointed in his place as Defence Secretary. So whether, I see some speculation that he might try and bring John Healey back, but it's very hard to see how John Healey could accept it unless there was a significant change to the money. And as it is, Keir Starmer topped up defence with 4.7 billion that wasn't in the Treasury's financial plan. So that's one of the first immediate issues that Andy Burnham has to deal with his Chancellor, whoever that may be, is where do we find that 4.7 billion from? But going forward, the kind of changes in defence spending that would be required if we were going to meet that target you mentioned, Hugo, then you're getting to somewhere between 20 and 30 billion a year by, say, 2029, 2030, if you wanted to meet it by then. Of extra money, 25 billion, 30 billion, that sort of money extra. So, that is a large amount. And I think the general view is in Whitehall that that settlement that Keir Starmer tried to give to John Healey, over which John Healey resigned, saying it was inadequate, is the sort of basis of the negotiation and will be with whoever carries on running defence now. So it's going to be very hard to move that up to the sort of money that the US and several of the other NATO members would like to see us spending.
I know Dan Jarvis has only been in the job as Defence Secretary for a few weeks, but will the military establishment be hoping he stays, do you think?
Well, it's often said that the senior military have diverging views on this question of whether having served is a big plus or not. So Dan Jarvis was in the parachute regiment. He did serve in the Special Forces Support Group in Afghanistan. And, in that sense, he is a no-messing combat veteran. So, yes, in that way, they know that he understands them, that he understands the culture of the armed forces. I think the bigger question about whether he stays or goes is simply that one of stability. John Healey spent the year before the Labour election victory getting his head around the job. It's a complex brief, a lot of money involved, all of the technologies, all of the inter-service rivalries, all of those things. And coming to it fresh, you've got a pretty steep learning curve. So the sense I'm getting is that people in the building would like the stability of having Dan Jarvis continue.
Let's turn now to Iran, where the US has struck targets for a 9th consecutive night. Donald Trump said last night that the latest attacks are in response to the killing of US troops in Jordan in an Iranian-backed strike on Friday. Oh, I think
we control the Strait. They don't control anything. So we'll see what happens. But we hit them very hard again tonight. And we did that in honor of the probably three. It's probably three as opposed to two. Great patriots.
Mark, is ceasefire falling apart, or are Washington and Tehran really still trying to avoid a return to all-out war?
Well, I mean, if you look at what they say, both Trump and Iranian leaders, you'd think we're right back to where we were in March and April. But actually, if you look at what they do, there are still some limitations. I mean, the most obvious of these is that Israel is not back in the war. Now, from an Iranian perspective, the Israeli Air Force is a very powerful hammer which could be used against them. So I'm guessing that for the moment, they don't want to draw Israel into this. You've also got this question which has come back again and again over the past few months as to whether the Houthi allies of Iran in Yemen would try and stop shipping going around from the Red Sea into the Arabian Sea, the so-called Bab el-Mandeb Strait. That's the other key choke point in this part of the world. And although they said a week ago that they were going to do it, and there have been one or two incidents with ships, it seems that escalatory step is not yet being taken either. So I think the question for the next few days will be, to what extent does the US increase its strikes against Iranian infrastructure? To what extent does then Iran make good on threats that if you do that, they'll really go at the Gulf states, the Arab states around the Gulf, and smash their infrastructure? And then, the escalatory dynamic gets very unpredictable. There have been some strikes against Kuwait, Bahrain, the Emirates, but not nearly at the level that we saw in March and April. And so the question also there is, if Iran does that in response to American strikes it doesn't like, those Gulf states themselves, like the United Arab Emirates, which did join in the bombing last time, may also start hitting Iran. So it becomes a much more general regional conflagration if those things happen. But so far, it's been contained at the level of the US and Iran with limited strikes on those neighbors.
With the US hitting Iranian infrastructure, Mark, and we're talking like bridges, ports, airports, and so on, the US line, the US rhetoric on this is that they're doing this to diminish Iran's capabilities to strike militarily. Without asking you to call anyone a liar, does that strike you as true, or are they doing it to just raise the pain in Iran? Is this the kind of economic warfare we were talking about last week?
Yes, well, they are. I mean, look, this is a fine point, and I've written about this recently. The question of what is a dual use facility, for example, NATO back, I don't know how many years ago, 27, I think it is, my bad maths, bombed several bridges in Serbia, which they said could be used to reinforce the military in Kosovo, which we were fighting over at the time, even though those bridges were 300 kilometers away from Kosovo. A lot of people said, really? Is that why you're doing this? Or is this a measure of coercion against the Belgrade government? Western countries tend to be nervous about this because if you hit what is defined as a purely civilian facility, and that might be a power station or something like that, then that is regarded as contrary to international humanitarian law. But an awful lot of people are doing it. And in fact, it's almost defaulted back now to one of the main forms of coercion. If we look at Ukraine is hitting lots of Russian oil terminals. Now, you could say that fuel from some of those terminals goes to the Russian military and in that sense perpetuates the Russian occupation of eastern Ukraine. And that's true. But you could also say that when you hit those, you're also causing huge problems for hundreds of thousands or even millions of Russians in those petrol queues who can't get their fuel. And I think it's pretty obvious that Ukraine wishes to have both of those effects on the Russian military forces and to remind the Russian population that they invaded Ukraine and that, they need to find a solution to this war. So these kinds of strikes are very tricky. Now, if you go back to a couple of months, the Israelis did hit some facilities in Iran, some steel mills and petrochemical facilities that I think a lot of people say, well, that's going to really harm the Iranian economy. Now, once again, Israel would have said, well, no, those steel mills were contributing to the war effort. And that's the real question, I think, now for Trump, although he has in his usual fashion, used a lot of threatening language on social media and in his press events about neutralizing Iranian infrastructure or smashing it up, destroying it, even using that phrase a couple of months ago about ending Iranian civilization. He hasn't actually taken the gloves off in that sense. And the strikes that the Americans have done in the past week, for example, on bridges leading to Iran's ports around the Strait of Hormuz, once again, the Americans would represent as being against a military target to stop them reinforcing. But I think we can see, as with those Ukrainian strikes, that these are dual-use facilities and a wider effect is intended, one of coercion and telling the Iranians, look, we can do a lot more damage to your economy if we want to.
Finally, Mark, you've been writing in your Substack about the role of America's senior military commanders as a source of stability during periods of political uncertainty. It's a fascinating argument. It's one I guess I'm more familiar with hearing made about countries like perhaps Israel, perhaps Turkey, perhaps even Pakistan. I'm not used to hearing it made about America. Talk us through it.
Well, this came out of a conference that I went to last week, which is called the Global Air and Space Chiefs Conference. Now, the head of the RAF basically hosts dozens of senior officers, top brass, from around 60 other air forces in London. And the press are allowed in, and there was a speech there by the outgoing chief of space operations. Now, this Space Command is a new thing in America that's been introduced a few years ago. And the first head of it, who's a general called Chance Saltzman, made a speech in which he very explicitly said that in these times of hyper-partisan politics, as he put it, that the senior military leadership should act as the ballast of the ship. Now, he explained what he meant by that, which is essentially to prevent rapid changes of policy and in a sense, to try and keep things on an even keel. Now, what was implicit in that message, but not explicit, was until we're past the Trump presidency. Effectively, he was coming as close as any senior American military leader I've heard to saying, look, we can get back to a more harmonious allied relationship between the United States and its allies post-Trump, and the military leadership is an important part of trying to ensure that the value of allies and the importance of listening to their opinions should continue going forward. So I thought that was quite unusual to hear that. I mean, let's face it, under the current administration and with Pete Hegseth at the Pentagon, a fair number of senior officers have either been dismissed or sidelined because they held views that were thought to be incompatible with those of the administration. So yes, you might say, gosh, look at where America's got to. And indeed, the MAGA faithful will use terms like deep state or blob to describe people like General Saltzman, I suspect, in expressing those views in favor of traditional alliances. But I think it was quite striking. And he wasn't the only one. He wasn't the only American senior officer who was talking in those sorts of terms.
Mark Urban, thank you very much indeed. Great to speak to you as always. And you can read Mark in the Sunday Times every week as well. Thank you, Mark Urban. This is Hugo Rifkind.